This week passed the 7-month mark from the beginning of the Israel-Hamas war, and I want to talk about where we are right now. Hamas announced it accepted a ceasefire proposal from Israel, and Israel said that the agreement was, quote, far from meeting Israel's core demands. Where are we in terms of this conflict and in terms of a potential ceasefire?
Well, really, over the last week, there have been two big questions. The first question was, will there be a ceasefire? In other words, will Israel and Hamas agree to a deal that ends the fighting for a period of several weeks, that allows the release of hostages that Hamas have been holding since October 7th, and that brings an end to the fighting in Gaza? The second question, which is, of course, related to the first question, is would Israel begin an offensive operation in Rafah? This, of course, is the city at the southern tip of Gaza. It is where most of the Gaza population is currently located. Over 1 million people have been taking shelter in Rafah over the last several months. But it is also where Hamas remains in a position. There are at least 4 battalions of Hamas fighters present in Rafah. There are a number of tunnels present in the town. And Israel has made it very clear that it does not consider its operation in Gaza complete until it is able to move into Rafah. So over the last 48 hours, we've seen developments on both of these fronts. As far as the Rafah operation goes, Israel has begun the operation. There have been airstrikes against Hamas targets in the city. There have been reports of Israeli ground troops moving into the city as well, even though there remain large numbers of civilians present. On the ceasefire talks, we seem to have hit yet another roadblock. Negotiators were present in Egypt up until today discussing a potential ceasefire deal. But reports suggest that both the Israeli and U.S. teams, led by CIA Director Bill Burns, have left Egypt, indicating that the ceasefire talks have reached yet another stalemate. So for the moment, a ceasefire doesn't appear to be in the cards, and Israel does appear to be proceeding into Rafah, despite President Biden's comments yesterday regarding continued U.S. aid.
Let's talk about those comments because Rafah has been a topic of conversation, especially within the past few days. As we know, weeks ago, President Biden said an Israeli offensive into Rafah was a red line for him. Just last night on a CNN interview, President Biden said that he would not send Israel weapons or artillery to support the Rafah invasion. What do you make of his comments?
Well, there's a little bit of nuance into what the United States is saying right now, what President Biden has been saying. As you note, several weeks ago, Biden did lay out a red line indicating that the U.S. would start to take measures withholding certain amounts of military aid if Israel proceeded with an offensive in Rafah that did not meet U.S. requirements. The U.S. had been looking for a concrete plan from Israel related to the evacuation of civilians, related to the continued flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza. The United States has been quite clear that it does not support an Israeli offensive into Rafah without some kind of plan to manage the civilian population. What Biden said last night suggests that the U.S. position has changed a little bit. He indicated that the United States really doesn't approve of any kind of Israeli offensive into Rafah, and that the U.S. would start withholding offensive weaponry. He and his administration have been clear that this weaponry includes airdropped bombs, artillery shells, other kinds of offensive weapons that Israel could use against Hamas and Rafah. The United States will not stop delivering defensive weaponry, including armaments used by Israel's Iron Dome anti-missile protection system. Other forms of aid will continue to flow. But what Biden has been signaling now is that he doesn't want to see an Israeli offensive into Rafah. He wants Israel to halt. The implicit suggestion here is that the United States wants to see Israel focus on a ceasefire deal. There's been a lot of pressure from the United States on the Netanyahu government towards a ceasefire deal, but given that talks in Egypt seem to have reached yet another stalemate, and given that Israel appears to be continuing its offensive into Rafah, regardless of what President Biden says, it's a little unclear as to what kind of impact the U.S. shift in position will really have in the short term.